Chairman of the Conservative Party. In our Cardiff studio, we're joined by Labour's MP Sarah Jones, who heads up an all-party group of MPs on knife crime, and in Glasgow, Michael Murray, who is a consultant neuroanaesthetist. Michael, I'd like to start with you because it's not so long ago that Glasgow was dubbed the murder capital of Europe, and yet, well, tell us about the measures that were brought in and what has been successful there in reducing such crime.
Essentially, a range of measures were introduced. It's not the best accolade to have of being named the most dangerous country in the developed world. So the Scottish Government at that time took a step back and said, let's try something new. Let's try an approach which addresses violence almost as a public health issue, which is similar to what was done in New York. But in essence, what they did was they took the best evidence available from around the world, they tailored it to Scotland to see what would work and what wouldn't work, and they launched a range of initiatives. They set up a division of the police called the Violence Reduction Unit, which initially was based in Glasgow, then spread out across the country, and again looking at innovative ways to address the issue. As a spin-off of that, my involvement came through several of my colleagues who set up a charity called Medics Against Violence. As doctors, we see more than our fair share of violence and violence-related injury. I work in a unit which essentially deals with head and neck and spine, and very often if you're going to get hit, you'll be hitting the head and neck or spine. And we would see the same people coming back, and we thought, can we do something to try and stop these people being injured in the first place, let alone them going out and injuring somebody else. So the Medics Against Violence programme was set up in 2008. So far we've spoken to round about 40,000 school children, which is the mainstay of our programme. We have a range of doctors, nurses, pharmacists, volunteers who go into schools, and we run a 1 hour lesson. We sometimes speak to an individual class, sometimes it's a whole school. And we show a video for about 20 minutes, which has a range of people in it from who've been exposed to violence, who've had violence perpetrated on them, or who indeed in several cases have actually murdered someone. So
you're showing young people the reality of what is happening or has in the past happened on the streets?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it puts some context to the reality of it. We then have a discussion with the kids, and we try and dispel some of the myths that a lot of the kids hold, that a knife keeps you safe, or there's a safe place to stab someone, when neither of those things are true. And we try and emphasise to kids that carrying a knife actually puts you at risk. It increases your risk of harm, and it's not a defensive weapon, it's an offensive weapon.
And how successful has it been?
Well, the murder rate in Scotland in 2004 was something like, it was just over 180. I think last year it was 57. Violent crime has roughly halved, and gang violence is down roughly by about 80%. So again, I can't attribute to one aspect, but I think all of those combined is more than coincidental.
Dr. Zubaida Haque, let's come to you, and apologies for getting your surname wrong a couple of moments ago. You do a lot of research on race equality, and obviously a lot of these attacks are perpetrated against black people, by black people. That's statistically the case?
I don't think it's helpful.
No, sure.
I don't think it's helpful to look at it in terms of black-on-black crime.
Because it's often seen as a gang thing, whereas from the examples we've had today, it is not.
No, and that's erroneous. First of all, there's a couple of myths that we just need to throw out. Yep. First of all, most crime is intra-ethnic. It's within the same ethnic group. So in that sense, it's a bit misleading to call it black-on-black crime. The other problem with calling it black-on-black crime is actually race is not the predictor of this crime. Race happens to be a description of the group, but it doesn't explain what's happening to this group. So in that sense, it's problematic. I think what we need to do is really step back. One of the biggest issues with knife crime and gun crime, I mean, this isn't new. We're talking about the statistics as though it's just this year, but this has been going on for a very long time, is we need to say to ourselves, what's been missing in this picture? And what's been missing are the victims. And I don't just mean the victims that have sadly died. It was heartbreaking to listen to Louise Samuels. I don't just mean those. I mean the ones who have nearly died. I mean the ones that have been injured. I mean the ones who are at risk. And so that's what's really missing. And it was great to listen to Michael to remind us that actually what we need is this holistic approach towards crime.
And what do you mean by that? What is a holistic approach? Because there's a lot of talk of stop and search, there's a lot of talk about increasing police numbers, that's what the Met Police in London have said they will do. What do you mean by a holistic approach? What
I mean is, so far, for instance, we've been looking at stop and search as though it is the only tool to address knife violence. And the problem is, it's not the only tool. It's not necessarily even fit for purpose. It's not addressing even what it wants to address, which is reduce violence. It doesn't reduce violence. It tends to be used more for drugs, drug arrests. And the other problem is it exacerbates community relations, which means that young people in communities are not coming to the police with information. They're certainly not coming to the police for protection. And what we know about young people carrying knives is there's two dominant reasons they carry knives. One is because of status, but actually that's not that much of a reason. The main reason young people carry knives is because they're scared. It's because they fear for their lives, and it's because they think no one is looking after them. So you asked me, what do I mean by holistic? What I mean is, I think the same as what Michael was talking about, which is that what we need is to approach this as a public health issue. This is a disease issue. This is a national crisis. And as soon as you approach it that way, it means that you don't just come in looking at enforcement, you don't just come in with suppression. It is important. It's important to send that message about, you know, control, about the fact that it's unacceptable to carry knives.
So can you just briefly give me a couple of practical steps?
Absolutely. So one is, of course, as Michael was talking about, which is, and what the Violence Reduction Unit uses in Glasgow, which is that you use both suppression as well as support. So you need to support these individuals. You can't just come in with a heavy hand, as we have been doing so far, and saying, if you don't behave, we will lock you up. But the other things we need, Matthew, is we need to reverse the cuts. We need to reverse the austerity cuts. And I don't mean that in a political point at all, Paul. What I mean is that so far we've been seeing the austerity cuts in terms of the economic cost to people's lives, the economic cuts. What we haven't really looked at is the social, how austerity cuts has removed the social safety net for people.
Okay, well, that's a good moment to bring in Paul Scully from the Conservative Party, because the focus has definitely been, political focus this week has definitely been on more powers for the police and more police on the streets. Do you think that is a one-sided approach?
I think but the reason it's in the media is because of the spike in the figures, and the spike in the figures definitely needs an immediate response. And in that regard, it is about looking at stop and search and how you can use it more effectively. So sensitively, as Zubaida says, but turning it towards knives and other weapons, in terms of focusing the police on the areas where gangs are most prevalent. And also, we've got the serious violence strategy that we're expecting next week that will be looking at any number of things.
I wonder why we're not hearing, I mean, all of these things you're saying are going on and putting more officers on the street in order to deal with an immediate crisis. I wonder why we're not hearing this from the government, from the Home Secretary. Why are they not more vocal and more visible in this?
Well, effectively, what you know, I was going to come on to the long-term things that you do then need to expect.
Just on this immediate point, we've got this crisis, as you've outlined, in London at the moment, and yet the Home Secretary and others, we bid the Home Office every day, they're not coming on. I know you can't talk for them, but I just wonder what it is you feel about this issue that stops the government having a more visible presence. Sitting in this chair.
So effectively, you're talking about, if we're talking about London, the reason is because they all need to work together. So the Home Office will set strategy for serious violence, give resource and give police certain powers. There will be lots of charities and organisations that we've been hearing about that will be working on the ground. But sitting in between this is the Mayor of London. And the Mayor, so that's why all three need to work together, because he's the guy that sets, he's the police commissioner for London effectively. So he sets strategy, he sets the police budget in the Metropolitan Police, he sets the numbers, and then Cressida Dick actually goes out and is operationally in charge. So he's a really pivotal guy in all of this.
Well, hopefully we'll get to speak to him, because he's another person who's been avoiding our calls recently. I mean, he has commented on it, but he's again... People seem reluctant to come forward on this, and I wonder, Sarah Jones, if I can bring you in now from Wales, where you are. I wonder whether many top-ranked politicians are reluctant to talk about this because it is such a complex issue and they just don't have the answers.
It is a complex issue. I think, to quote what Michael said at the start, when you have a problem as big as this, you need to step back and think, actually, what works? Let's try something new. Now, there is evidence of what works, but it is difficult, it's absolutely right. But I think the government have now got to the point where they absolutely have to act. The all-party group on knife crime that I chair has members from all political parties, and this is not just a London problem, this is a UK problem. Knife crime has gone up 21% in the last year across the UK. This is not just London. And I think it's got to the stage now where a proper public health approach that we've just been talking about, which is absolutely the right thing to do, is something that the government is beginning to look at, and I really hope in the strategy that comes out next week they implement a proper long-term plan with proper resources that focuses on prevention as well as, of course, dealing with the crime.
And in headline terms, what, Sarah Jones, does that plan look like? How does it tackle the crisis at the immediate moment that we're in at the moment, but also going forward?
Well, for me, there's an immediate issue around policing. The Met, just as an example, have to make another £400 million cuts over the next few years. We know that they're going to lose about 3,000 police. That's planned over the next couple of years. So those issues need to be reversed. We need proper policing. But on the public health side, it means real intervention with the children and the young people that are involved in crime and carrying knives now, real intensive youth work and support, and it means education for everybody else to inoculate, if you like, the whole population against this epidemic, and to work with young people in schools and of course in all the youth centres that we would like to see, and all the services across the board. Mental health has a big part to play here. There's a whole raft of services that need to be involved in prevention.
Sarah, I mean, you're talking there about everything you've said sounds perfectly credible, and up in Scotland, Michael is nodding at the sort of things that you're suggesting, and yet, as Dr. Zubaida Haque has pointed out, a lot of the young people don't trust authority. They don't trust this top-down approach. How do you address that?
Well, you have to work with young people, and you have to work with them repeatedly so they get to trust you.
But
so,
what does it mean working with them?
Well, so the young people that I've met with, we had a big group of young people who've been in prison for knife crime, came to Parliament a couple of months ago, and we talked to them, and they talked about their lived experience, which was, you know, not having their particular special need at school addressed, so they ended up being excluded and they got into a pupil referral unit, not having adults intervening at the right places, not having those proper relationships, so not just somebody who comes in, has a couple of sessions and then moves on, having proper long-term work and support, youth workers working with young people. And you know, prison is not a deterrent for a lot of these young people, because some of them were saying to me, which is shocking, that it was even a bit of a rest to be in prison because they weren't having to do the things they were having to do on the streets.
Well,
so we need a different approach.
It's interesting, Sarah, that you bring up that point. I mean, Dr. Zubaida Haque, Louise Samuel, the sister of one of the people killed this year in London, earlier said, actually, she thought tougher sentences, make sure that people know they will never get out of prison again. Yes.
I mean, the problem is that might work for some people that carry knives, especially those that carry it for status-related reasons. I'm afraid it does nothing for those who fear for their own lives, who fear for their safety, and who feel that no one's looking after them. Because, as they've said in many an interview, which is, well, I'd rather be alive than, you know, I'd rather be alive, so it doesn't matter to me if I get arrested. It's no deterrent. And research has shown that stronger sentences does not deter violent crime. I think the other thing, Matthew, I was going to say, and I just wanted to add to Sarah, to what Sarah was saying here, that we haven't talked about, is these young people don't have hope. They don't have hope. They don't think there is a way out of their lives at the moment because they've had to live these lives. It's that lived experience of living in deprived areas that have high crime rates. You know, their upbringing has been difficult, so they've been excluded from schools. We know what the issues are, but for them, there's no hope. And that is something that we really need to address, where we start giving them back that hope.
And Michael Murray, it sounds as if the experience in Scotland, in Glasgow, is that they were able to give at least some people some hope. How?
I think by a range of things. As part of our school lesson, we also, we don't just say to kids, you're all going to die, because that tends to put them off a bit, but we say, what do you want? What would you like to do with your life? What do you aspire to? What can you think? And I feel it's important also that one of the subtext to our message is also the elephant in the room, which hasn't really been mentioned, which is alcohol. Alcohol is involved in about half of all violent crime. And at the moment, that's not really being addressed. And it's one of the big issues. And we can't change violent behaviour if we don't have some notion that alcohol is probably too cheap, that it's not viewed properly, that it's abused fairly regularly. And people who carry knives, who go from being someone who thinks they're defending themselves, you combine it with alcohol, they can become the aggressor. And I think we need to also look at the effect of alcohol. As I say, if something affects half of all violent crime, it's an important issue. We can't leave that aside.
Paul Scully, do you think that there are enough resources? Resources have been mentioned by a couple of people in the last 10 minutes. Do you think there are enough financial resources to deal with this problem in London and indeed in the other cities where
well, I can talk mainly about London, and I think there are. The Mayor has transferable budget, so he can move money between the police, transport and other areas. So he has got the resource, and he needs to make sure that he's taking full responsibility for that role. But we've got to look at the immediate solutions that I was talking about. But then you're absolutely right, Zubaida, to talk about the holistic view, because then it's actually leveraging the loads of people that are working on the ground. Sarah's patch, she's got a great thing called Lives Not Knives, who do wonderful work. I've got Ray and Vi Donovan, who's in my patch, whose son was murdered 15 years ago. They go into schools, they go into prisons to try and break the cycle.
And let me ask you very briefly, these ideas have been around for a long time. Why have they not yet been taken up, and what hope is there? What hope can we have that they will be taken up right now?
I think this is just the wake-up call. I think this is the wake-up call, because these things have been working in parts of London, in other cities as well. But actually, you need to look at it as a city rather than just one borough or one area, because if you're trying it in one area, and it doesn't, and people will just move out to another borough, and that violent crime will just spike in another area. These are people's lives that we're talking about here.
Although poverty does make a difference, Paul. I mean, poverty is one of the main predictors of crime, and we know from research that if you address poverty, if you have poverty alleviating measures, and I'm talking about particular poor areas, then that makes a massive difference to crime rates.
I think you're right to talk about hope.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much indeed, all four of you. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so we're going to leave it there. I know we could talk for another half hour about it, but thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, still to come.